Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 15th of November 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We're delighted today to be joined both by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives and also Alex Thomson, Eastern Approaches. And Alex is reporting from the Netherlands. Well, Mike, interesting, the BBC has moved across to Mugabe, but we know that the real important news at the moment remains defence. And the evidence coming forward is, of course, that Britain's defence is now in a perilous state. This has been deliberately engineered by successive governments. What's the latest?
Well, that's right. The Defence Select Committee was meeting yesterday, and there were a number of people giving evidence at it. On screen, we've got sort of the main points here. Defence is close to breaking point. Unless you put more money in, it's going to fall over. The army is 20 years out of date. It's not fit for purpose. Amongst other people, General Sir Richard Barnes was saying that. But David Ellis, you were at that meeting in the public audience, in the public gallery rather, and Richard Barnes wasn't the only person making these comments.
No, he wasn't. There was Admiral Sir George Zambalis, which you can see on the film clip there, and Air Marshal Barry North, and they essentially gave oral evidence there to the Defence Committee to the effect, which I find quite ironic considering we had the European PESCO meeting the day before, where all those nations signed away their sovereignty and their military into the corporation of the EU. But these guys gave, frankly, a first-rate, polished performance on the reality, the actual status of what Her Majesty's Armed Service is in. I felt that they were completely in line with what we are saying and both what you guys there are saying at the UK column, in terms of it isn't fit for purpose. I mean, we've been sort of saying that there are no ships actually fighting capable, and we heard from General Sir Richard Barnes yesterday that the army could not sustain any war fighting currently as it stands. It's 20 years out of date. It's not fit for purpose, which was frankly a jaw-dropping moment in the auditorium there. I was sat immediately next to Ben Farmer from the Telegraph and Deborah Haynes from the Times, and they were absolutely gobsmacked, as were, everybody in the audience at the level of punchiness. There was no holds barred. It was gloves off. Look, we've had, and I'm quoting from Richard Barnes here, poor government. We're failing in duty to protect the country. I mean, you can't get something put in stronger terms than that. We want an army that's actually fighting fit. George Zambalis, the anti-submarine warfare capability is inadequate. He then went on to say, post-questioning, that there was a rumor that there were no that there was a period where there was no strategic attack submarines that defend our ballistic missile submarines. So the two work hand in glove. That there was none actually put to sea, that was a rumour, and it was put to him by one of the MPs on the panel, and he responded in a frankly a splendid fashion, considering I suppose he was bound by the Official Secrets Act in a way, by coughing a bit and then going, well, as a First Sea Lord, I would ideally like a number more than one and not naught. Now, frankly, I think that told it all. That was probably the most professional way of delivering a damning indictment upon these ministers that are responsible for facilitating the funding from the Treasury into the armed services for this. So, some of the knockout lines that were coming from these guys were just absolutely, on the one hand, it's so sad for us to be hearing this, but on the other hand, this was the reality check that's needed. But you've got to say this with one caveat, that for many, many years now, these senior officers have been speaking out and they have been ignored. I mean, this is what triggered me into getting into gear, was what Admiral Sandy Woodward was saying in 2010. So the story's been the same. So we've now got to the point where basically these guys are saying, look, we can't defend the islands. that was essentially the message, that nothing works. It's absolutely, the term was hollowed out. So, their gambit was that there wasn't enough money from George Zambellis, and the responsibilities that they were asked to undertake within the defence programme and the SDSR 2015 could not be done. That the services were falling apart was another one, and I think that some of the other quotes which were quite crucial were that the denial to hold it all together, that government was in denial that the military would hold it all together under goodwill. But considering that the amount of smashing that the service personnel have had and endured with the best of their forebears and the old guard, particularly Royal Marines, paratroopers, being arrested for doing their job in the line of duty, which the Crown has asked them to do. I've got to perhaps cite the Marine A case and things like that with Al Blackman. So I've got to say, of all the days I could have picked to have gone to DEFCON, this was frankly one of the best moments, because everything sort of come together.
Right, David, was there any mention of European military unification during this meeting?
Well, there was in the lobbies between me and some of the officers, and they were all very much opposed to it, didn't want to have anything to do with it, and the comments were quite strong. I'm not going to repeat them on air. I then cited, well, as long as, obviously that was one fundamental for us, that we needed to have that as a baseline, because we can't go forwards unless we stabilise that situation. And the caveat was then at that stage, I said, well, are we all in agreement that the lack of money is a lie? Which they all said yes. They all accepted that was a lie. So there was a lot of questioning to do with Michael Fallon as well, actually, during the committee. And essentially what we were doing, what we come to, the conclusion I come to was basically that what Fallon had said in DEFCON previously was completely incoherent.
Yeah. David, if I may, just perhaps for some of our viewers and listeners who may be new to the subject of the state of Britain's armed forces, but let's summarise a little bit what we know. We know that in the Royal Navy things have got so bad that only a couple of weeks ago the report was there wasn't one single Royal Navy ship that was 100% operational. We've seen reports that the Navy is going to be short of surface-to-surface weapons, air-to-surface, in particular helicopter-launched air-to-surface weapons. We've got problems with recruitment across the board. We've got 20% shortfall in trained warfare personnel in the Royal Navy. We've got the fact that the nuclear submarines are not operational. The Trident boats, the so-called bombers, the nuclear deterrent boats are going out, but the SSNs that should be going out to patrol and protect Britain's nuclear deterrent, we now know that they're not operational. You've now told us that the report is that the Army is, quote, 20 years out of date. We've got massive problems with the size of the Army now, because 80-odd thousand men is simply not enough to carry any form of significant combat. We've also been hearing reports that, for example, in the RAF, the Tornadoes are no longer serviceable. So this is a massive breakdown of Britain's military capability. You've just used the term hollowed out. This is not a question of not enough money, surely, David. This is a question of deliberate policy in order to break down Britain's defences. This is deliberate.
Well, certainly what's deliberate is the direction of money and policy. They can't say that was accidental or incidental. And from my point of view, this is a question of redirecting money from Bank of England, Her Majesty's Treasury, away from Her Majesty's Armed Services and into EU streams. So there's the money nonsense for a start off. And you've got to sort of then say, well, there must have been a gambit and a perspective within those upper echelons and those higher offices that they would manage and go on a pan-European military unification, military union route. Because we have got, despite of all of this with PESCO not being signed for the time being, that's the caveat. And there are options still out there for additional membership of EU PESCO and military union. So other countries are being solicited as we speak. So my overall feeling with this, in terms of what's happened to British defence, is that they just frankly, at a Treasury and above level, thought that they would manage it on an EU basis, and that would be okay because it would be jam tomorrow and rosy, and we would have this pan-European corporation to do the industry, and we would have pan-European military to do both the internal and the external, how can we say, without being demeaning to service personnel, the wet work. So it's got to be carefully worded how you kind of put that over. So we are where we are, and Zambellis is using the word hollowed out. And the key thing here is, of course, is, well, actually, you know, if you had to choose a word from an admiral's perspective, okay, well, let's go with that because he's at the coalface. And I've got to say, when the civil servant was questioned subsequent to the officers here, Sir Mark Lyle, who was around the SDSR 2015, denied that hollowing out had taken place and said that he had not seen any evidence to that end. So Mark, Right Honourable Mark Francois, had Ben said to him, well, no, that's not the case. We've just had evidence from the former First Sea Lord here, saying that the armed services have been hollowed out. And Mark Lyle stuck to his guns and was just in absolute denial that this was the case.
Yep.
So, you know, I think that the reality check here has got to come from two quarters. The MPs have to start doing their job and get out of their Stockholm syndrome that they're within their parties and start doing their job. And they've got to make these civil servants come good, because this nonsense, you know, that we're seeing here, you know, this utter denial that this is the case. And there was a lot of talk about, you know, why do we need a new review and so on and so forth? Why are we having this mini review? What was wrong with the last review? Well, clearly the last review was an utter load of nonsense, and they thought that they would go off in a period and let's say join up with junkers. I mean, well, what other option was there? You know, you get to a point where you've cut the military to such an extent where it can't function as a national military. Then there is no other option, is there?
Indeed. Well, look, let's move on to this. Alex, let's bring you in at this point, because I mentioned on Monday that Boris Johnson, I showed the little video clip of him arriving at the European Council meeting where the PESCO deal was done, and we showed how Boris was blustering his way through 90% of what he had to say. In the last couple of sentences, he sort of tipped his hat to Defence Union and said that Britain's role in this was to be the flying buttress to the EU's cathedral of Defence Union. And of course, we saw nothing in the mainstream media about the European Council meeting, and we saw nothing, or well, I speculated offline off this programme with Patrick Henningsen about whether, when the Foreign Office put that Boris Johnson's statement up on the Foreign Office website, whether that would be the Defence Union comments would be edited out, and indeed they were. So we had complete radio silence in the UK from the Foreign Office to the mainstream media over this. Not so on the mainland of Europe. And you've put an article up on the UK Column website, how the Dutch press reports EU military union.
Yes, Mike, and as you can see the Dutch headline there, under the video of Mogherini, that very video which has not made it to the British mainstream press, that's there in Algemeen Dagblad, a Rotterdam paper, and then the headline is Nederland tekent voor Europese defensie. So straight away, the Netherlands signs up to a European Union military. Well, defensie can mean armed forces or defence, but note that even at the stage of the headline that there's no mealy-mouthed nonsense about cooperation. The body of the text, which I've summarised on the next slide from the Algemeen Dagblad, shows that there has been fear of hollowing out of NATO over the decades. And they even point out a date which I wasn't aware of during the 1950s, when this was all coming together, Mike, is that the Assemblée Nationale, the French Parliament under de Gaulle, and just before they revised their constitution, in fact, so this wasn't even in the Fifth Republic, but the Fourth, they said no to the cooperation or PESCO as it now is, because they could see which way the wind was blowing. And the Dutch journalist puts in an exclamation mark that it's taken 60 years to get further. And he's also noted correctly that it was the Franco-German axis that drove it. And then we see, as you switch to there, that Brussels, as the Dutch journalist is reporting, has already allocated the first €500 million of money, which has been siphoned off from national projects, of course, to promote the fusing of industrial defence industries. And then at the end, we see the Dutch journalist admitting that this is going to mean the breaking open, as he puts it himself, opengebroken in Dutch, the breaking open of the defence industry and forcing them to compete for tenders on a Europe-wide basis. And very tellingly at the bottom, after we see that the admission to the Dutch reader that, yes, our Navy and Air Force are already intertwined with Belgium and our army is already under German command, it says, soon all member states will have units which are interoperable. And this is a phrase which has been upon us since the turn of the millennium, hasn't it, Mike? And now we see what the meaning was, even when it was used in Britain in the civil service, let alone the military back in 2000-ish. We now see what that means. It means independent of which umbrella and acronym it goes with. So it's globalism, the iron fist of globalism, in the velvet glove of interchangeable acronyms is how I now understand the term interoperable, because interoperable here is defined as units which can be used either for NATO, EU, UN, or other operations. So we can play as many musical chairs as we want, but globalist configurations will continue to use the same troops, the same grunt work. As a codicil to that, and it's difficult to say anything about recruitment policy without sounding snobbish, but I'm going to go for it, we've had deliberate policies in army recruitment in particular, less so in the other services, of keeping certain areas of the northeast of England, the central belt of Scotland, the South Wales valleys depressed and devoid of other work opportunities in order to recruit the young men. And some recruiting sergeants have written to companies openly accepting that. Now the French and Germans are doing the same. They don't have the Fijians to recruit or the Gurkhas, but they're now openly saying, both, first of all, the Germans, which has become a security issue in Germany, and now Macron, now he's clinging ever closer to this German axis. They're openly saying, well, you needn't be a citizen of our country or even a citizen of an EU member state in order to serve in any of our national militaries under this PESCO umbrella. So we're very soon going to see Arab, Slav, whatever mercenaries serving to make up the bulk of this military, which in turn is going to be interoperable with civilian policing operations to quell internal dissent.
And that is the real dangerous aspect of this, because this is something that I'll just remind everybody. Federica Mogherini and Jens Stoltenberg were really pushing very hard at the October-November 2015 European Defence Agency conference. This intermingling and this merging of civilian and military functions. This goes alongside what we've been saying with PESCO.
Yes, this is it. There's going to be, I think it's so interoperable. If we look at the top level blocks, if you look at our Joel Skousen interview, and others have said the same, if the EU decides to hang America and to make the best of a bad lot and cut loose from America for various reasons, such as isolationism, as it's sometimes derided as, or whatever, if the Orwellian three power blocks shift so that Eurasia and East Asia are together against Oceania, shall we say, then with the new Chinese infrastructure developing, you could easily see even Chinese units or even African mercenary units serving through train-borne shuttling, being deployed in Western Europe if there are problems there, dissent. So I think I can really see that coming now. This is going to be the army for the world island, to put it in Sir Halford Mackinder's terms. Everything that isn't the Americas and Oceania is going to be in this military system, as far as I can see, with the City of London presiding over it.
Well, look, we got to move on a bit and get through some of this stuff. But this is your article, How the Dutch Press Reports EU Military Union. Suggest everybody goes and looks at it. Now, it's not all bad news, Brian, because Lockheed Martin has said that they have now delivered the 13th F-35 to the Ministry of Defence. So this is fantastic news, isn't it?
Well, clearly we're going to be dominating the world with those
F-35s.
But F-35, if there's enough oxygen.
Well, indeed, because unfortunately, as we reported many months ago, the F-35 was grounded for quite some time. as a result of pilots experiencing hypoxia. Unfortunately, it's still happening, and even more unfortunately, nobody knows why, or nobody can give any real explanation as to why this is going on. Let's have a look at defence and sort of autonomous vehicles and AI and so on, because in the Defence Minister in the Defence Select Committee meeting, Admiral Zambellis was saying something. He was asked a question by Plymouth MP Johnny Mercer, who's looking, I have to say, very fetching in his new moustache. Let's have a look at this.
The country's just had the 2015 SDSR, so for your average guy or girl in the street, we're going to start thinking the keys in the title are Strategic Defence Review. What would your, now we're doing one sort of mid-term, what would your priorities be, and why do you think we're doing it?
I think there's two fundamental considerations for conducting a capability review. The first is that the strategic circumstances have significantly shifted globally since the last Defence and Security Review, and you can spend some time examining what they are, but most of us have a feel for what they are. And the second, which I think is a fundamentally misinterpreted responsibility, is the rise of technology, which is going to hugely change the nature of defence and security in the next 20, 30 years, including the widespread use of autonomous vehicles and unmanned vehicles employing artificial intelligence, therefore taking people out of the loop in increasingly large numbers. Admiral Zambellis will be very delighted to know that Harriet Baldwin has just been in the United States for the first ever demonstration of a UK-US unmanned military vehicle convoy, which has taken place as part of the last mile logistics to frontline troops. It's an exercise, a robotics demonstration between US and UK armies in Michigan. So this is what she had to say. 100 years ago, we pioneered tank warfare with our US allies, and today we remain at the forefront of military technology together. This exercise has proven the success of our ongoing investment in science and technology as we see concepts becoming reality. This particular project is spearheading solutions to the notoriously dangerous operation of supplying our front line on the battlefield. Delivering crucial food, fuel, and ammo remotely will help save soldiers' lives. David, Ellis, if we are increasingly looking at the use of autonomous vehicles and we're increasingly removing people from the battlefield, then who becomes the target then under those circumstances? Are we heading towards a world where the only people that are on the receiving end of what we're throwing is civilian populations?
This is all heading in a very nasty direction. And you've got some blatant contradictory stuff here from Mrs. Baldwin. Because it's not 5 minutes ago she was telling Brian Gerrish there that there was nothing wrong with the Royal Navy. Well, we've just heard that's a pack of lies, which of course we all knew, but getting some sort of sense of admission on that would be difficult. So, in conjunction with, I think we couldn't get a response from Gary Street or any of that. So, and there she is saying, oh, well, this is all brilliant. Jam tomorrow, we're going to get this lovely new stuff where it's all going to be remote. And yet we've got these three senior officers saying that the expectations and the budgets and so on and so forth, and the whole thing basically has cracked. It's not fit for purpose. It couldn't do what they would expect we would have to do if we had to go to war. So there's a complete litany here of contradiction from this woman. It's completely incoherent. It's exactly the same as it is from Mike Fallon, just incoherent nonsense, gibberish. But ultimately, what's the direction they're going down here with this AI? They want remote strike capability on a grand scale. And the question there, of course, is who controls that? So if you're going to put remote strike capability, if you're going to take people out of the loop, it's somebody with a gun or somebody with a finger on some kind of trigger, ultimately saying yes or no to orders from some other person, an officer, Now, of course, if you're going to take people out of that loop and just do it remotely, digitally, computerized, at some stage, considering this horrendous hybrid warfare that we've seen for the last 20 odd years in the Near East and the immediate Eurasian borders, and the destruction that's happened out there, who's going to control this? If the EU are going to do this, then that's a tyranny. Nobody elects them. Who the hell's in charge? Who does Junkers take his orders from? Nobody knows.
Well,
these people are not accountable, and you're going to have remote strike capability with AI. No way. It's like something from the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
Well, it gets better, Brian. It gets better because yesterday, Treason May Philip Hammond. Today, Treason May and Philip Hammond are hosting a Downing Street reception for the tech sector, and they say this is going to reaffirm the government's commitment to innovation. So they're going to have leading digital entrepreneurs and innovators from across the country, and she has announced a series of measures to support the continued growth of the tech sector, including doubling to 2,000 the number of visas available for the brightest and best talents from around the world, an investment of £21 million to expand Tech City, which you can see on screen there, their website, which is a nationwide, it's going to be a nationwide network, growth accelerator, as they call it. It invests in tech companies and so on, and also creates networks of tech people. So another 20 million fund to help public services take advantage of UK expertise, including in the use of artificial intelligence. The launch of another £20 million training programme, which is going to challenge thousands of young people. There it is, cyber discovery, between the ages of 14 and 18 to test their skills against simulated online cyber threats. This all follows on from the government's digital strategy, as they call it, our digital strategy. I'm not certain that it's my digital strategy or yours, Brian, but it's theirs. And that was published in March. It sets out how they intend to make the UK the best place to build and grow a digital business. It set up 7 pillars which underpin the changes that they want to see. The second pillar, just list a couple of them here. The second pillar is skills. The third pillar is making the UK the best place in the world to start and grow a digital business. The sixth pillar is to digitise the government. And then the final pillar is data. So in order to sort of soften the data gathering and surveillance aspect of this, they're going to introduce the new Data Protection Bill, which apparently is going to bring UK law into line with the European Union, which seems like a strange thing to do under the circumstances. Under the proposals, individuals will have more control over their data, the right to be forgotten and to ask for personal data to be erased and so on. We're going to change history in that process, but that's kind of to soften the pill of the amount of data collection that we're going to have. It's not just government, it's also the Bank of England. They're pretty keen to challenge people on the cybersecurity issue, and they're offering an internment to anybody. I think internment is probably the wrong word there.
Yes.
It might be a Freudian slip. They're offering people to come and work for them for a short time while they learn about cybersecurity and so on. But it doesn't end with the military, and it doesn't end with government, and it doesn't end with turning us all into digital citizens, because apparently it's going to go for the police as well. Artificial intelligence for policing. This is the Oxford Internet Institute. They're holding an event in a week's time or so. And who's speaking at it is a lady from the Open University. This is just mentioned that the Oxford Internet Institute is a multidisciplinary research and teaching department at the University of Oxford. And I say they've got Dr. Miriam Fernandez from the Open University to give a talk on artificial intelligence for policing. It will provide an overview of how AI and technology development can contribute to existing policing practices. And in particular, they're going to look at 3 different projects. Police engagement via social media. We've talked about that recently, Brian. They're also going to talk about detecting grooming behavior on social media using AI. And they're going to look at radicalization. They're going to
turn the PREVENT program into an artificial intelligence program is what they would like to do. So we're finding autonomy, AI, moving into all our major institutions. And nobody is actually taking a step back and asking, is this actually what we want to do?
And of course, the development of the AI itself means that a smaller and smaller team of experts are the people who understand that AI, and therefore a smaller and smaller group of people are in control of anything that AI controls.
Well, and in fact, it goes further, doesn't it? Because they're saying that at some point they will not understand it themselves. Should we just ask Alex briefly for comment on this?
Yes, to make it pithy, Mike, I think to tie the two strands of this program together we've had thus far, there's going to be a unified military force for the world island, deployable under as many hats as need be. And secondly, the use of AI. Well, what ties these together in my mind is Israel. That's the country that unites the three blocks, Europe, Asia and Africa. And it's the country which has had its finger right in the pie of this particular kind of AI for many decades, now openly celebrated as a tech giant or whatever, or the startup nation. But the current form of this AI, for example, if you go on the tube or the Docklands Light Railway through the city, you'll see all these adverts for Palantir, which is presented as a kind of Ivy League bright kids playground. But it goes back to the frame, which has continued to be used in NSA as PRISM, and which was first developed as PROMIS, PROMIS, in a Washington law firm in the 80s. And again, Israel's hands are all over this. And in fact, there's a trail of bodies when you look closely as well, anyone who gets too close to finding out what this is all about. So I'm not saying the nation Israel is behind all this, but Israel is a center of operations and benefit for all the elements we've been talking about today.
Alex, thank you very much for that. Well, I'm going to say policy is often the thing to follow. It's not the nation, it's who conducts a certain policy. But let's come back onto the Royal Navy. This is a story which has now come up both in local press here in Plymouth and also nationally. We've got senior Royal Navy officer groped away at junior rating on board a Plymouth based frigate, a jury has been told now. This case is ongoing at the moment, so our reporting has got to be suitably measured, but it concerns this gentleman, Charles Howson, involved with all sorts of organisations locally, an incredible list of interests, including the NHS and the railways. But he's been accused of groping sailors. This is going back into the 80s. One of the former ratings said Howson started groping away at his crotch area, touching his genitals above his trousers. And the person went on and said, I was like a rabbit caught in the headlights. I did not know what was going on. I was shocked. Now, the point that I'm going to make on this, of course, is that incidents that take place on board a warship, this is a very difficult environment. There is nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. And when people abuse power, they are in a very, very powerful position. So this is part of the main headline. Ex-Navy officer Charles Howson groped men on board the ship. The ship was HMS Cleopatra, figured there. I served on this ship myself at the time that Charles Howson was second in command. I'll leave that statement there. There'll be more said in due course when this trial is over. But the prosecutor, Paul Dunkles QC, said the alleged offences between December 85 and September 1994 were about sexual behaviour towards young males, which could be described as groping. And he also went on to say the common theme was his dominant position, his rank, age, or position. And this is the pernicious thing, Mike, that when somebody in a senior position with immense power does something inappropriate with a junior rank, that is a very frightening position for that young person to be in. And this is the other statement. Mr. Howson was emboldened because he thought he could face off any allegations. I'm too powerful, I can get away with it. Now, one of the organisations that Mr. Howson worked in after his time serving in the Navy was Groundwork Trust. Very interesting charity, popped up in the late 80s, early 90s. It's suddenly helping create better communities. He was involved in that. The allegations say that abuse of youngsters involved with this charity took place, but the key thing is nobody did anything. What this charity is, I didn't quite realise at the time. I get a feeling of big society now, Mike. This is community activism, and if you have a look at the inset there, this is showing groundwork operating right the way across the country. Some interesting partners and sponsors, including the Department for Community, but this is the key issue. The court heard how a groundwork trust official spoke to 6 of the men who were alleging abuse by Howson. Spoke to them in February 1993. The matter was not reported to the police. So there was a cover-up in the Royal Navy. There was a cover-up within Groundwork Trust. You have to say why. Here's Charles Howson as one of the patrons of Armed Forces Day. He's listed alongside local MPs. In Plymouth, it was impossible really not to bump into this man at some time. He was so powerful. But let's consider what was happening with this one. This was the report of a captain of one of the nuclear deterrent submarines had sex with a young female officer on board, and he was relieved of his command. But look at the headline there. After some of his crew revolted over the alleged incident, no, revolt at sea is mutiny. We've now got, as a result of policy, introducing females on board the ships. And I'm not saying that it was the girl solely at fault. He was certainly at fault as the commanding officer. But as a result of the policy, we've now got mutiny on board one of the nuclear deterrent boats. And we have consistently warned, of course, that the British Ministry of Defence has approved Satanism. This is Armed Forces News, part of the TV. They almost seem to be advertising it, Mike, in this article. Encourage people to go and have a look at this. But it ends on a positive note that just because this man's involved in Satanism doesn't mean he can't do his job in the Royal Navy. And I think we could have some discussion on that. This was the Royal Navy's comments. We're an equal opportunities employer and we don't stop anybody from having their own religious values. Our policy is that whatever practical, reasonable requests for time and facilities that do not impact on operational effective or welfare of other personnel are met. This has got to be a lie. Alex, I'm going to let you respond to this one very quickly. I think we are watching an engineered breakdown of discipline and morale within our armed forces. I'll come back to this statement that, of course, in a warship, if you're at sea, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. So any bullying or abuse that takes place is magnified greatly. This is a despicable British government policy.
Yes, Brian, I mean, to make it as brief as possible, Marxist thinking, which involves the breakdown of institutions, families and nations, finds natural allies in certain destructive tendencies in any religious persuasion, in Sunni Islamism of the extreme kinds, and particularly in Satanism and certain forms of Judaism, because all of these have a doctrine of destroying the unbeliever and destroying the world. You can't say that that's true of the majority of Jews or Muslims, but you can say it's true of the majority of Satanists, because Satanism is par excellence and by its definition a destructive and deceptive creed. It's, Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, and more particularly Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law, contains detailed instructions for destruction and deception that would go far in advance of anything that Islam or Judaism are accused of having. Satanism is, by default, a revolt against religion and indeed against family and national order. It's got no comparison with any other religion, and to put it under the umbrella of a religion is, of course, a slap in the face to believers of any kind and to honest secular atheist patriots as well. We need to listen more to the likes of Robert Greene and Wilfred Wong about this, and directly to those who've been victimized by Satanists, and not listen to their PR machine.
Just before we move on, Brian, that first image you showed, Mr. Howson seemed to be very close to the royal family.
Immensely.
Is this another example of someone who has been behaving in a certain way that has, like Jimmy Savile, close connections to the royal family. This can't be a coincidence, can it?
Well, I wouldn't have said so, but he has immensely close connections with the royal family. The royal family appeared in Plymouth, it seemed, at the drop of a house and hat. But more on that in due course. As I say, that hearing is going on as we speak, and therefore our reporting has got to be particularly measured. We will wait, of course, until there's a final judgment in that case, and then we're going to be able to comment a lot more. I'm just going to remind people we're talking about the breakdown of our armed services. This was the comment by Danny Kruger, Tory advisor to David Cameron. The Conservatives plan to introduce a period of, quote, creative destruction in the public services. And that was reinforced by Nicholas Bowles MP, who said the Prime Minister and his deputy Nick Clegg want their people power revolution to unleash chaotic effects across local communities. Chaotic, therefore, in our vocabulary is a good thing. So there is the proof of the Conservative policy, at least, to cause breakdown. Now, let's come on to a happier subject. A big thank you to all those of the British Constitution Group who helped the special briefing in the City of London last night. It was a very, very useful meeting, and we'd like to say thank you to everybody that helped make that happen. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to former Metropolitan Policeman John Wedger, who turned up and gave a wonderful synopsis of the harassment and bullying which he's suffered from the Met Police since he took the lid off the protection of those abusing children. And of course, John Wedger is also talking about abuse of children by members of Westminster itself. Compare this brave man to this man, Sergeant Tangy of Devon and Cornwall Police, who is now getting Herald article time because he's sending out tweets. I find this astonishing, Mike. People can go and have a look at Sergeant Tangy's Twitter page themselves, but this is one of, I think, his most pathetic efforts, but it's promoted him to a major article in the local paper, Policing by Twitter by a Twit.
Right. The Telegraph here has got an article from Penny Mordaunt, who, of course, is the new International Development Minister, and she's saying that she will prove that Britain can be proud of its aid and that it can trust the way that we spend it. So Britain can trust the way that UK aid spends its money. That's fantastic. Well, Penny Mordaunt, you could start by releasing the financial statements, the quarterly financial statements that you receive on behalf and from the White Helmets in Syria, which describe where British aid money is being spent. So please feel free to respond to my already refused Freedom of Information request on this issue and get me that information straight away. And then I will believe that you are going to prove that Britain can be proud of its aid budget. Right, Brian, I think we're going to end on this one. Alex, first evidence that Russia used Twitter to influence Brexit. This is all over the British media at the moment. How much further, how much more are we going to have to listen to this absolute tripe? I did notice, by the way, before you comment, that there was some suggestion at the Defence Committee meeting that there was evidence that Russia had been behaving in this way and that military people had been briefed on this. But what are your thoughts?
Well, if you keep that slide there a moment, Mike, it's a bit hard for me to see on this screen. But the main thing is that I've underlined in red on the left there that Wired.com is calling this the first evidence that Russia used Twitter to influence Brexit. And it's talking about rhetoric. So there's no actual influence on how to vote. It's talking about tweets from people who tended to pop up. Anyone who's active on Twitter will see them. These people who pop up who may or may not be where they say they are, saying, I'm a patriotic Texan or whatever. Tweeting scenes of rioting in Europe and say, what the hell's going on in Europe? And apparently, according to this, quote, security startup, New Knowledge, which is a US-based organization, as you'll see, which I've quoted from the article in Wired, we now have the first proof. We get to see a couple of the tweets, none of the traffic data, metadata, just the tweets themselves with enraged Texan saying, I don't like what's happening in Europe. And then this bunch, New Knowledge, then say, oh, yes, here's a Russian network that we've just dug up. And what I'd fished out there from the About Us page on New Knowledge is that the chap on the left was a former US State Department consultant And the lady on the right, who is part of his hobby horse organisation, which is Data for Democracy. That sounds nice and unsinister, doesn't it? In light of what we were discussing earlier, the lady on the right has been dragged in by him as CEO because she's in this Data for Democracy outfit, and she's an anthropologist. This gives me a bit of a clue as to what's going on here with these claims and how they're being fed through to the so-called tech press. But I suppose you have thoughts of your own, Mike.
Well, I mean, one obvious thought is, of course, with so many people concerned about privacy, and particularly if you're running a Twitter account that maybe you want to remain anonymous, people are using virtual private networking, VPNs. Quite often they connect to VPN servers in Russia. And one of the bases for a lot of this rhetoric seems to be that traffic is coming from Russian IP addresses. Well, that doesn't actually prove anything, Alex.
No, because packets, even 10, 15 years ago when I got into this business, packets even then had the technology to be split up by microsecond. And if it was cheaper to send them via China or via Russia over land cables or satellite links rather than the Atlantic and Pacific fiber optic links, then that would be done. It could just be a split second, or one tweet out of a series will turn out to have a Russian IP address or a Chinese address. And shock horror, some Americans, even Trump-supporting Republicans from down in Texas, occasionally actually manage to visit Russia, and sometimes they go there to do some real tourism. So, a Russian IP address does not say very much.
No.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. It's a great shame in a way, because there is simply so much to report about. But we have put out great and detailed information there on the state of Britain's armed forces. Why is this important to every man, woman and child in the country? Because without our armed forces, we cease to exist as a nation state. I think our guests today have been very measured in their analysis of who has said what. I personally believe that to bring our armed forces into this state, perilous state, represents high treason. That is the expression I'm going to use. I'll leave the audience to think about that, but don't just sit and listen to UK Column. If you like and agree with what we're putting out, please check it, push that information out far and wide. That's why we do what we do. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.